We'll go ahead and open up your Bibles to John chapter 2. John chapter 2. Ron Henson, I'm going to have you read first. I'm going to have you read John 2, 1 through 11 here in a minute after I get through the introduction a little bit. This takes place, what we're going to be reading about takes place in Cana in Galilee. It's about 9 miles away from Nazareth in Galilee. And there's a bunch of people there. And Jesus is there, and the people that are following are there at this wedding. There's people who used to be fishermen. There's people who used to be a tax collector. There's zealots. There's Christ, the man of peace. And so they've left a lot to follow Jesus. They've left their nets, they've left their money, they've left their boats, they've left their jobs and homes and friends to follow Jesus. And so this extraordinary event, the first of 7 signs that Jesus does, is in this first section, verses 1 through 11. And today we're going to a wedding, and Jesus goes to a wedding, and they start, their faith is starting to grow here into Jesus. All right, do you have chapter 2, verses 1 through 11? Ron Henson, if you'll go ahead and read for us John 2, 1 through 11.
And the third day there was a marriage in Cana of Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. And both Jesus was called and his disciples to the marriage. And when they wanted wine, the mother of Jesus said unto him, They have no wine. Jesus said unto her, Woman, what have I to do with thee? Mine hour is not yet come. His mother saith unto the servants, Whatsoever he saith unto you, do it. And there were set there 6 water pots of stone, after the manners of purifying the Jews, containing 2 or 3 firkins apiece. Jesus saith unto them, Fill the water pots with water. And they filled them up to the brim. And he said unto them, Draw out now and bear unto the governor of the feast. And they bare it. When the ruler of the feast had tested the water that was made wine, and knew not whence it was, but the servants which drew the water knew the governor of the feast, and called the bridegroom, and said unto him, Every man at the beginning doth set forth good wine, and when men have well drunk, they which is worse, but thou hast kept the good wine unto now. This beginning of miracles did Jesus in Cana of Galilee, and manifested forth his glory, and his disciples believed on him.
Okay, so let's just go through the story a little bit, get the facts down here. And so as Ron was reading that to us, what problem did Jesus' mother bring to his attention? No wine. We're out of the wine. So describe these water jars. What's it say about them? They're made out of stone. So you're not going to just pick them up and walk around with them, right? And how big are they? 20 to 30 gallons. That's pretty big. So these are very big, and they're very heavy. If you were here marking your Bibles, you noted that they were there for ceremonial washing, and so they were there so people could keep going through the washing ceremonies that they would go through. So what instructions did Jesus give his servants? Fill them up and give something to the master of the feast. Give a drink of that out of those water pots to the master of the feast. But what happened to that water that was in the jars? It had been turned into wine. To run out of drinks at an occasion like a wedding, that would be a terrible thing, wouldn't it? It would be embarrassing, wouldn't it? It would be disruptive. You've been to parties and we run out of ice, and different things, but if there's nothing to drink, it's hard to eat everything, right? And so that would be very embarrassing for them. And one person I read said this is a shame-based culture, and so people would be shaming this person because they ran out. And Mary comes and asks Jesus, hey, they're out. Now, if this was maybe just somebody that they knew, may not be a big deal to her, but some people make a big deal that she's making a big deal. So they say, well, maybe this is a relative, a close friend, a younger sister of Jesus. We don't know exactly. It doesn't tell us. So she's not just say, oh, this is so sad, this happened to them. But she wants Jesus to do something about it. And so verse 5 seems to indicate that she expects Jesus to do something about it, and more than likely, she's been a widow now. We don't know how long. That's our guess here. By the time that Jesus is starting his ministry, Jesus has been around, and so I'm sure she depended upon him for a lot of things. And so her first thought, Jesus will take care of this. He'll fix this. Is she thinking about a miracle? We don't know. She knows who he is. She was told, Joseph was told, they've lived their life with him, and so she expects him to take care of this. Wedding celebrations at that time were very festive. They said to have last 7 days. That'd wear you out, wouldn't it? I mean, you can only play so much Parcheesi and different games and talk to so many people for so long. But, all these things are happening here, right? And so all this stuff is happening at the wedding, and it's going on for several days. And so there's friends, and there's neighbors, and there's relatives, and they're celebrating, and Jesus has got all these people who are following him now there. And the servants are the ones who are going to do all the hard work, aren't they? There's guests to tend to. There's food to get ready. There's everything to serve, the messes to clean up. But for the guests, it's a time of joy. They're having a lot of fun, celebrating the marriage of the bride and the groom, strengthening ties between the friends and the family. And it looks like Jesus is reluctant to do what she wants, but he does do what she wants. And so let's look at a couple more questions maybe. When we don't really want to do something or it's inconvenient, how do we respond when maybe God wants us to do something and we don't? That's a good question, isn't it? We may just try to not do it. Yeah. Yeah, we might just try to put it off. We might be impatient, or we might yield to God's will, right? We can understand he wants this in us, and he wants us to do this. This is how he wants us to be, and so we yield to it. Anything else you're thinking there? So what does the master of the banquet discover when he tastes the wine? It's good. It's good. So the master of the banquet tastes the wine. He declares it wonderful. He even comments to the groom that now normally you bring out the good stuff at first, and then later you bring out the lesser quality, and instead the groom has saved the best for now. The master doesn't know what's happened, but the servants know what happened. Look at verse 11 again. We're in John chapter 2, verse 11. And this is the beginning of signs that Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So what is made known, what is made manifest here about Jesus? Okay, he's done a miracle. He's truly God in the flesh. Shows forth his glory, which shows us that he is God, right? That's what the text says. And then how do the disciples respond to all this? Yeah. They were already following him. Remember, we looked a little bit more at Andrew last week, and he's been following John, and John's been saying, hey, this is the guy you got to be listening to. And Andrew follows him and spends a day with him and is convinced himself, brings Peter. And we noticed Philip last week. And so he's convinced already that Jesus is the Christ. And he brings Nathanael. And Nathanael then, Jesus says, when I saw you under the broom tree. And he goes like, you couldn't have seen me under the broom tree. You must be more than just a man. And so he declares him to be the Christ. And so he does all that too, doesn't he? And so they believe. In what way does the turning the water into wine reveal Jesus' glory? And some of this has been said already, but how does that reveal God's glory? How does that manifest that he is God?
Miracle. I mean, this is not something that normally happens, so it had to be. This could only be done by God.
This can only be done by God. Exactly. We're in John 2. It shows he has power nobody else has. But then the miracle began to reveal his purpose. He has come to fill the empty. He has come to sweeten the stale. He has come to change the ordinary into something extraordinary. He's come to do something big. Johnny, can you read the next verse for us? Let's all go to 2 Corinthians. It'll give us a second to get there. Chapter 4 and verse 7. 2 Corinthians chapter 4 and verse 7. Let's figure out a lesson for us in what's happening here many years ago. You got it? 2 Corinthians 4:7. Go ahead, Johnny.
But we have this treasure in earthen vessels, that the excellence of the power may be of God and not of us.
So you and I are jars of clay. We're not all that, we're not all that much to see or be about. We're ordinary, but we have been created for an extraordinary purpose, have we not? We are to showcase God's glory, and we are the ones who show to the world his majesty, his might. Now, we can't display it like Jesus did, but certainly we can share it, can't we? By ourselves, we're just a jar of clay. We're dry, we're empty, but when we are filled to the brim with his sweetness and refreshment, we can be transforming to the world around us. We were made new to change the world around us. Just as the water was changed, we have been changed, and we change those around us. Anything you're thinking about there? Here's a question. I want you to think about this one just a second. Why do I need to be transformed? Why do I need to be different now that I've come in contact with Jesus than before? What's the reason here? Why do I need to be transformed? Yes, sir. Okay. Okay.
We are of Christ or in Christ and do
Okay.
as he will.
We need to be transformed so we can show that we're of Christ, following Christ.
Before we were of the world, in the world, but we're not of the world.
Yeah, it's transformation. We're still in the world, but we're not of the world anymore. What was about before, we have repented of that. We keep turning away from the world. We keep the transforming process, don't we, throughout our lives? Aren't we still? None of you are perfect yet, are you? Sorry. Maybe one out there. We're still working on this transformation. But yes, okay. Anybody else? Why do we need to be transformed? And we're all saying the same thing, but you may have a better way of saying it.
Paul wrote, when we were yet without strength, Christ died for the ungodly. And so obviously that was the condition, our condition, before being transformed to be like him.
Okay. Okay, so we can have that life eternal. We need to go through this transformation. All right, I think, is anybody else? I don't want to cut anybody off. Oh, yes, Jackson. Say the last part. I can't hear it.
Repentance is asked for.
As for. As for change, yes. It is a change. We are changing. We're not about what we used to be. We're changing. And so this is the beginning of Jesus' signs. And so John, as we mentioned before in the introduction, he goes through 7 miracles, 7 signs, acknowledges the fact that they all point away from the acts of themselves to something that's more important. John records only 7 miracles, if you don't count the resurrection and the great catch of fish. There's 7 main signs, and they're identified that way. And of course, John knew that Jesus had performed many more miracles, but he only gives us these 7. From these 7 different miracles, we can learn many, many things. We learn that Jesus is the Son of God. We learn that Jesus has compassion and is benevolent. We can also learn that life comes from Jesus Christ, the Son of God. Do you believe these signs occurred? Did Jesus really do what the Gospel of John says he did? If you do not believe, could you defend that lack of faith? And then notice this. If you're willing to accept that these signs really do what the Gospel of John says he did, we realize that Jesus is the Son of God, and that changes my reaction to him and my life. And we can believe in that fact. And of course, belief is an action word. We've talked about that many times, and we can be part of the saved. And you can have a hope of life now and in eternity. That was brought up through Jesus Christ if you obey him. Anything else that you wanted to bring up? We'll make sure we focused on something we could learn from it today.
I guess, Doug, every time I read this, and I don't know if this is really the point of what you're trying to cover today, but back to verse 4.
Okay.
His reaction to when, Mary comes in and says, hey, they're out of water. It's almost like he's like, well, that's really not my problem. I mean, it's not what he says, but it's kind of the tone you get. But then, of course, he goes and changes the water to wine. I just thought that was interesting. Every time I read this, that reaction always just sort of sticks out when you go through that, reading that.
Yeah, he calls his mother woman, and if we did that, she might smack us. Yeah, right?
I think it's really, it's like instead of saying mom or whatever, it's like woman, I'm not going to deal with that, it's just, like, it's just not something that's almost like worthy of my attention or whatever, but of course, he does it, but it's just that reaction just always sticks out when you read this.
Mm-hmm. It does, yeah. That's a good one. That's good to bring that out. Anybody want to comment on that? Him calling her woman? What's this got to do with me? My hour has not yet come.
He referred to her even in John chapter 19. He used the same, he said woman, when she was at the foot of his cross.
Mm-hmm.
Woman, behold thy son. So, and I noticed a couple other like maybe he was being rude or whatever. But I think really that's just the way they address the women. And even, I think, John 20:15 and Matthew 15:28. You know, even Mary Magdalene woman, you know, so I don't, you know, I think that's just the way that.
Matthew 25:28 was the other reference you have down? Matthew 15:28. Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's probably just the way they address each other. So he's not being disrespectful. There's a family that used to be on TV. They had that Duck Dynasty show, and one of the sons always calls his father by his first name, and it always bothered me because in our society you don't do that, you know. But in their family, that's how they dealt with each other. And the other ones call him Dad, but the one calls him by his first name. And yeah, to us that would sound, I couldn't do that. Yes, sir.
That we do now that we don't think is offensive or whatever. But back then, if they would have heard us talking this way, they'd be like, whoa.
Yeah, their culture would, probably take us that way too. Yes, sir.
The important part of that verse is, you know, what is your concern of you? My hour has not yet come. And it's almost like he's saying, you know, it's not time for me to fully reveal myself
Right.
as the Son of God. You know, so, and he's very careful about these time markers that we have through the Gospels. My hour has not yet come. He heals a man. Don't tell anybody. You know, things like that. And so he's careful to not fully reveal himself. He's on a definite time schedule for, you know, for ultimately for the Passover and, you know, 2 or 3 years here. But that's a big part of it. So
And you think, Doug, when Mary came looking for him, and he said to her, I must be about my father's business. So, I mean, despite what was going on, the priority was why he came, his father sent him. But I think it's wonderful that he did do what he helped. You know, he helped and the whole situation.
Yeah.
And God glorified because he did it. I sort of did some reading about when they say his disciples believed. And one of the points that was made was that that's kind of how our belief is. We continue to believe. As we learn, our faith is increased. So, you know, it's a continual thing.
Yeah, it wasn't like there was zero belief and they went. Yeah, very good. Thank you for bringing that out. Yes, sir.
The initial response was more of the, you know, the human side, which was, hey, it's not my problem. But then his actual response, the action he took, was the godly side. His miracle.
That's a good way to think of it too. The flesh versus the spirit. Doing the right thing. Michael Inge, if you could, everybody go back to John 2 and we'll pick up now with verse 12. And Michael Inge, if you wouldn't mind reading this, the rest of the chapter, verses 12 through 25.
You said what verses?
12 through 25.
This he went down to Capernaum, and he, his mother, his brother, and his disciples, and they did not stay there many days. Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem, and he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves, and the money changed during business. When he had made a whip of cords, he drove them out of the temple with the sheep and oxen, and poured out the charges, money, and overturned the tables. And he said to those who sold doves, take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise. Then his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house has eaten me up. So Jesus answered and said to him, what signs do you show to us, since you do these things? Jesus answered and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Then the Jews said, "It has taken 40 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" And he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that, and he had said to them, and they believed the scriptures and the words which Jesus had said. Now when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed in his name when they saw the signs which he did. But Jesus did not commit himself to them before. He knew all men, and he had no need that anyone should testify of men, for he knew what was in man.
Okay, let's look at a few questions here. Get the story down in our brains here a little bit. So what does Jesus find when he enters the courts of Jerusalem? A market. I'll mention a little bit more about that in a minute, but what the market would have kind of looked like. But yeah, this is a place there in the Jewish, out from the temple, there's a place for the Gentiles to worship, and they've turned it into a marketplace. So what does Jesus do? He drives them out. He takes some cords, makes them into a whip, and he takes them out, and the sheep are let go, and the oxen, and the money's going everywhere, and the tables are turned over. And what does Jesus say to the dove sellers? Take these things out of here. Get these things out of here. Don't make my Father's house a house of merchandise. And so how do the Jews respond to these actions? What signs are you going to show us that you have authority to do this? So it's Passover in Jerusalem. Thousands of people are in town. And I read a little story today about in India, and there's a festival going on, and it lasts several days, and 400 million people are expected to go to this particular place. Now that's more than the United States has as population. Can you believe it? And everybody goes to this place. And so like 10 million, I don't know how they check them off, but it's about average of about 10 million a day go to this place, and it happens every 12 years for them to do their worship there. But Jerusalem is full too. Thousands of the people are there. They're remembering, they're celebrating. Jesus comes to the temple to reflect on God's protection and deliverance. The Jews do that. Sorry, I didn't mean to say Jesus. The Jews come to reflect upon Jesus and God and his deliverance, to honor God through their sacrifices and their dedication. And like I said, you've got the Holy of Holies, you've got the holy place, and then you got courts out from that. There's courts for the men to worship. There's a place for the women to worship. And way in the back, about as far as you can go, is where the Gentiles can worship. But what's in there? Well, they've set it up with approved sacrifices, okay? You may have brought your lamb, and it might be perfect, but it's not the approved sacrifice. So they've got to sell you an approved sacrifice. And we can't use your Roman money, so we've got to exchange it over to temple money, and they're going to make some money on that. And so you've got this stand and this stand and this stand as you come in, and they're like, exchange your money here, you know, and you got some people over there, and you got the sheep going on and the goats going on, and you got doves, and you got all this noise going on, and here are some Gentiles trying to worship God. And so Jesus sees this, and he gets pretty upset. Very upset. Imagine all this is going on. So he reaches for cords, creates a whip. He's moving with indignation, we could say. He drives the cattle, the sheep from the place. The doves are flying, the coins are flying, and the disciples that are with him, their mouth is probably open. What's going on here? What's happening? And later they'll remember, zeal for your house will consume me. And the Jews are staring in disbelief. What does he mean when he says, you have turned this house into a marketplace? What authority does a nobody from Nazareth have to come in and disrupt this temple activity? Steve, will you read verse 19 again? Chapter 2, verse 19.
Jesus answered and said to them, destroy this temple in 3 days, and I will raise it up.
Okay, I guess I should have stopped before I did that. Anybody else have anything to say about tearing up the temple?
I guess interesting, the verse 18, the response of the Jews, what sign do you show us? You know, it's, this version of it, I guess this is the New King James Version. Since you do these things, I guess they're questioning his authority in one sense, but interesting, the terminology there of what sign. Like they're looking for something else, and perhaps for him to demonstrate, who he is, why he has this kind of authority to be able to do that, because he is actually defending God in this instance. He is offended by what's going on in the Lord's house, and he is standing in that place to defend what ought to be taking place. And I guess they're saying, you need to show us why you have that kind of authority.
To which he answers, here's the sign, destroy this temple and I'll raise it again in 3 days. Here's your sign. Now, what's he talking about?
The dead, the resurrection.
Yeah. Right. Raising from the dead to resurrection. But if you or I were there, we probably wouldn't have got that. We wouldn't have got it. They don't get it. And what do they think?
Physical building of the temple.
Look at this place. It took us 46 years in the rebuilding project here. We've been in this rebuilding phase. Herod come in here and rebuilt this place, and it's a lot better than when Zerubbabel built it. It looks a lot nicer now. And look at this place. You're going to build it in 3 days? You can see why they're dismissing him. But the disciples later will remember. Go ahead.
It's interesting to see that, like you say, well, we would have missed it, or they obviously missed it. And people miss it today when they hear what Jesus says oftentimes, that they don't realize that Jesus most of the time is not talking about physical things. There are a number of times he used physical things to tell, to demonstrate, or I guess bring about a spiritual truth. And sometimes, people got caught up in the physical and missed the spiritual truth that he was really bringing. That still happens today.
Yeah, we still do that with his parables. We try to make too much of them, I think. Sometimes we try to make too many points out of it, and we miss what he's driving towards. So these people are stunned. They're ready to dismiss him. And you can't possibly rebuild this place. It's taken us 46 years in the remodeling project. But the disciples here, and then later they're going to remember this, okay? Tyler Young, could you read verses 20 through 22? Let me catch it up here. Could you read chapter 2, 20 through 22? Not Tyler Young. Tyler Young, he's in Texas, isn't he? I told you, it's hard for me to think when I'm up here. Go ahead, sir.
Chapter 2, 20 through 22. Then the Jews said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days." But he was speaking of the temple of his body. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scriptures and the word which Jesus had said.
Okay, so John helps us, the reader, in case we didn't get it, as we're reading here. He's not talking about a temple of stones, but rather the temple of his body, the new tabernacle of God's presence on earth as God lives within us. So Jesus, in a human body, reveals the Father. He became the new locality of God's presence on the earth, and it's the power of the resurrection that builds a new kind of temple in the heart of believers. And baptism clears the ground of all the rubble, of all the rebellion, of all the jagged stones of our sin, and calling on his name lays a new foundation, and a dwelling place for God is constructed in the consecrated hearts of Christians. I got that from a 21st century Christian class book that I'm using, those flowery words. But things are different now. There's a new type of temple. It's in our heart, where God is, where he rules our lives. Anything else you're thinking about that? Anything else you're thinking about those verses? Harry, I'm trying to go through. Harry, if you could turn to Ephesians. Everybody turn to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2. Could you read chapter 2 there in Ephesians verses 19 through 22, please?
Therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building being fitted together grows into a holy temple of the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of the God in the Spirit.
What new identity do you have now as a Christian? We're fellow citizens with all the saints and members of we're part of the household of God. We're all citizens together. We're all part of this together. And the chief cornerstone of all of this is Jesus Christ. We're building our lives, we're building ourselves upon him, his teachings, his instructions, his life. And what is he building in you? A dwelling place, yes. Or some versions say a holy temple in the Lord. Very good. He's building it. So he dwells in us. We're like a temple. It's not physical. You are a holy temple in the Lord. Your heart is a dwelling place of the Most High. His presence rests within you, and daily he's building you up for his glory. When God walks through your temple, what does Jesus see? What do we want him to see? Well, of course, God longs to see lives that are full of love, lives where we praise him, our relationships with each other, righteous relationships. On any given day, we'd love for Jesus to walk through, right? Maybe not sometimes, right? If we're involved in something. But walk through, look at us, see what we're focused about, see where our temple directs itself. Sometimes our temple, though, looks like the temple here looked kind of scattered. Sheep over here, goats, cows, all these things. Misplaced focus, impure motives, battered integrity, compromised relationships. We're not focused where we should be, and we wonder why don't I feel his presence? We've just been too far away from him, right? Our temple needs to be love, praise, righteous. What are you thinking of about that?
Reminded of David's words in Psalm 51, verse 10. He said, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a steadfast spirit within me." Think about from the standpoint of God walking through our temple. What does he see? We'd like for him to not only see, but to create in us that kind of heart, that kind of steadfastness that we need to be able to walk in a way that glorifies Him, keeps us on that straight and narrow path that leads to life.
Something you could add to your prayers today. Keep me steadfast. Keep me having a pure heart. Keep me, my conscience. Yes, sir.
The common picture of Jesus is of this meek and sort of mild and sort of weak kind of, very quiet kind of persona. Jesus was that, certainly something, but this is a picture of a very righteous anger, and he is flying through the temple. He is destroying everything, and this was, as you said, there was thousands of people here. This is God showing his extreme displeasure at distorting his, the purity of worship and making it a material gain, all those kinds of things. So that's a real clear picture that is often kind of ignored, about Jesus. So it's, and just two quick things, just switching gears back to the water and the wine. Mary went to Jesus, just for another quick application. Mary had a problem and she went to Jesus. And that's a good lesson for us. And then this last thing here, in verse 10, every man at the beginning sets out good wine, and when he gets it well drunk, the inferior, you kept the good wine until now. Christianity promises the best for last. Think about it that way. This life we live in is hard and struggles and everything else, but Christianity saves the best for last. If we're faithful and obedient, it's heaven that we have. That's the best. That's the last.
That is the best for last, isn't it? One more thought, and then the bell's going to ring. Jesus can cleanse your temple. He wants to create a place in your heart where he can dwell closely with you, walk through your heart without tripping over our misled priorities. However, it's hard to do when we are full of ourselves. And so, less of me and more of him. Less of me and more of him. Chapter 3 next week. Chapter 3 is the most challenging chapter, I think, in the book. And I spent a lot of time working on it. So, hopefully. And I would like you to try to work on it, struggle with it a little bit, see if you can't understand it before we get here together next week. I haven't quite finished everything. I guess I'm up to chapter 15 in my notes, but that I've been working on. But chapter 3 is a tough one. So do what you can to understand that before we get here next week. Thank you all.